Here's the recipe if you want to take a screenshot.
Welcome back to Cooking with Miss Stockton. Today's recipe is maple pecan scones, one of my very most favorite. If you don't have pecans, you can use any other nut or leave out the nuts altogether. You could substitute in berries for the nuts if you'd like. It's a very flexible recipe. You can also easily cut it in half. Oftentimes when I make it, I make a half recipe, and today's instruction is actually going to be about how to adjust your measurements. So there'll be some information today about adjusting measurements. For today, you're going to need 3.5 cups of flour, a half teaspoon of baking soda, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, a little salt, some sugar, 1 cup or 2 sticks of unsalted butter, or if you just have salted butter, that would be fine. 1¼ cups of coarsely chopped pecans, 3/4 cup of heavy cream, and 3/4 cup of buttermilk. And if you don't have heavy cream or you don't have buttermilk, that's okay. You could substitute milk for both. Then you'll want to add in, say, a tablespoon of lemon juice or of vinegar to promote the interaction between the baking soda and what would be the buttermilk, or the acid that you would be introducing if you're making a substitution there. For this recipe, there's an optional and delicious glaze that you could put on top. It's made out of maple syrup and powdered sugar. And then you want to preheat your oven. In this case, it's to 375 degrees. I've already preheated my oven. And then for this recipe, you would take a baking sheet, a cookie sheet, or a jelly roll pan like you see here, and you could cover it with some parchment. Or if you happen to have stoneware, I have some stoneware, and I'm going to cook my scones on this stoneware. The first step of this recipe is to mix together your dry ingredients, and I'm actually going to sift today. I'm using a sieve as opposed to a regular traditional sifter because it's what I have, and also it's because this is what they use at the Buttery, which is a bakery that's nearby to me. So I'm going to get my first cup of flour here. I'm using all-purpose flour. I'm going to put that right in my sieve that's hanging here on my bowl. I'm actually going to mix in with that flour my half teaspoon of baking soda. Don't want to mix those up. I want the full tablespoon of the powder. And it's just because I've noticed that my soda is getting a little bit lumpy, and I don't want to have any lumps of soda inside my product. So I'm going to go ahead and let that sift through. I have some lumps here of soda at the bottom of my sieve, so I'm going to press that through with the bottom of my tablespoon measurement to get it nice and integrated into my flour. Then I'm going to mix in the remaining parts of my flour. The next step in your recipe is to mix in your salt and your sugar. This recipe calls for coarse salt, and I actually purchased some. You can go ahead and just reuse regular table salt if that's what you have, no problem. That substitution will work. So you're going to want a half a teaspoon, making sure this is 1/4, of salt. And again, I'm going to measure that over something else, whoops, just in case I spill, which of course I did. And I put that in. Whew, it seems like a little large. We'll see if we get little bursts of salt flakes as we eat these. And then you're going to want 3/4 of a cup of sugar. Now what I have for my 3/4 of a cup is my half cup and a 1/4 cup, because there are 2 quarters in 1/2. So I can use this 3 times, or I can use a half cup and a 1/4 cup. And sugar cooking is all about math. So I've added the sugar and the salt to my dry ingredients, and I'm just going to mix those dry ingredients well with a spoon. I want to do this before I add my liquid because I don't want to start changing that gluten in the flour. I don't want to form those long polymer strands because I want these to be really fluffy, wonderful, tender scones. The next step is you're going to add your butter to your dry ingredients. This is something, your butter in this case, where you do not want to have it at room temperature. My buttermilk and my whipping cream I've had sit out for just a bit, so they're more at room temperature, but the butter you want to be very cold. And then since you don't want to have a lot of motion when you mix it or you cut it into your dry ingredients, you want to pre-cut it into little cubes, 1 cup of butter. So once you have your butter into cubes like this, you're going to go ahead and add it to your flour. And I'm putting it with my fingers, but I'm touching it as little as possible because the heat of my hands will actually start it to melt and to soften. So I'm trying to put it in different areas, but I'm touching it as little as possible. Then I'm going to use a pastry blender or 2 knives to cut in the butter to the dry ingredients. All right, so this is a pastry blender, and you can use this to cut in your butter. You could also use 2 knives. Before people had pastry blenders, they would actually use the knives to just cut in that butter. You're going to want the butter to be in the size of small peas when you're all done. It's a little bit more challenging with the knives, but it can absolutely be done. You can also use this pastry blender. What you do is you just move it around your bowl and try to cut in that butter. Now sometimes you might need to touch your pastry blender to get the butter off the sides. You could knock it on the side of your bowl a little bit. Again, try to avoid handling the butter with your hands as much as possible. Typically when I make this recipe, I use a Cuisinart with the blade attachment and just a few pulses to incorporate the butter into the flour. But I wanted to show you that you can do this by hand as well as if you have a really cool tool like a Cuisinart. So after you used your pastry blender or your knives or your Cuisinart or even your stand mixer to incorporate your butter into your flour until it's just done, and you have sort of butter in the size of small peas in your flour, it's time to mix in your pecans. And the recipe calls for 1 1/2 cups of pecans. So I've got those here, coarsely chopped. Next, you're going to form a well in the center of your ingredients, and into that well you are going to put your buttermilk and your heavy cream, and of each you need 3/4 of a cup. So this is my buttermilk, so 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk right in that well, and then the same of the heavy whipping cream. Again, you could substitute milk or half and half or a non-dairy like an almond milk here, and it should all work. All right, so next you're going to go ahead and incorporate that liquid into your dry ingredients, and you want to mix until it's just mixed. You're going to have a little bit of flour still. It's going to be a sort of a, they call a shaggy batter. All right, after your dough has come together into a shaggy mess, just like this, you're going to want to take a bit and form it into balls real gently, not perfect balls, about 2.5 inches in diameter. And you're going to go ahead and put those right onto your prepared baking sheet, whether it's a cookie sheet covered with parchment or just a bit of cooking spray, or like I have here some stoneware. The stoneware is nice because it browns the bottom while the top is browning, and leaving a little bit of room for them to expand. So I made actually more scones than this recipe called. 1, 2, 3, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 2 extra. So they might be a little bit smaller than yours are. So get them to this size, and then you're going to put them into that preheated oven and cook them for 25 to 30 minutes or until they're golden brown. All right, to make your glaze, what you're going to use is 2/3 of a cup of maple syrup. So I'm going to go ahead and pour that into your liquid measuring cup, 2/3 of a cup. let it all drain out into your bowl. And again, remember, this step, the glaze, can be omitted. You don't need to put the glaze on the scones. They're delicious without it, but they do add that sort of extra treat if you want it. Next, you're going to need to sift into that maple syrup 1.5 cups of powdered or confectioner's sugar. And I'm just sort of not measuring this incredibly carefully, just there's 1/2 cup. And I'm going to get another 1/2 cup because you're going to want 1.5 total. And I'm going to go ahead and sift that using my sieve. Go in my last 1/2 cup, so 1.5 cups total of powdered sugar. I'm going to use actually the edge of my measuring cup to press the powdered sugar through the sieve. I'm pressing and sort of shaking it at the same time. This helps the process go a little bit more quickly. And once you've got that all integrated, or at least added to your bowl, then you can go ahead and take up your spoon and mix it in. All right, so you're just going to go ahead and mix in that powdered sugar really, really well. This is where you do want to stir until it's perfectly integrated. You have a nice, really smooth glaze with a little bit of powdered sugar sticking to my spoon there. So I'm going to mix that in, and when my scones come out of the oven, I'll be able to put the glaze onto the scones. So after your scones come out of the oven, you can go ahead and transfer them to a wire rack, maybe over a Jelly Roll pan, or the recipe says over a rack of newspaper, to catch any overflow from your glaze. You're supposed to let them cool for 10 minutes before you put the glaze on, so I'll come back after these have cooled for about 10 minutes. As soon as your scones have had some time to rest, 10 minutes ideally, 5 minutes if you just can't wait. If you're like me, you want to take a tablespoon of your glaze and put it over each spoon. The reason you want to wait is because if you don't, it'll all just run right off because the scones will still be too hot. So I'm going to feel hopeful here that some of it at least will stay on. Not too hot, although it hasn't been a full 10 minutes. After this, you can put them on a plate and enjoy. Sometimes if you don't wait the full 10 minutes to put your glaze on your scones, you might get a little overflow like this, but that's delicious too.